She didn't call it drama. She didn't call it coincidence. She called it calculated. After weeks of silence, Jaguar Wright stepped forward with a chilling claim. What everyone thought was spontaneous wasn't. According to her, the fallout wasn't emotional, it wasn't impulsive, and it definitely wasn't random. She says decisions were made long before the public ever saw tension. Conversations happened off camera, positions were chosen quietly, and when the moment finally exploded online, it was already set in motion. So what was planned? Who knew? And why does she insist this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding? Stay with us, because if Jaguar is right, then what we witnessed wasn't chaos, it was execution. According to Jaguar Wright, the first mistake people made was believing the timing. She says the timing was intentional, not accidental, not emotional, intentional. When the situation first became public, it felt reactive. Something happened. Someone responded. The internet amplified it, but Jaguar claims that's the illusion. She says what people saw was not the beginning. It was the launch. According to her, the real conversations happened weeks, possibly months, before anything surfaced online. Strategic discussions, positioning conversations, calculations about optics and fallout. She doesn't frame it as a conspiracy, she frames it as preparation for impact. Jaguar explained that in high-visibility spaces, nothing major happens without awareness. Not necessarily control, but awareness. People know when pressure is building. They sense when narratives are about to shift. And when they sense it, see how they prepare. She claims this situation followed a familiar pattern. Step 1, internal tension. Step 2, private negotiation. Step 3, controlled exposure. Step 4, public reaction. Most people only saw Step 4. According to Jaguar, that's why it felt chaotic, because the groundwork was invisible. She says the reason it wasn't random is simple. Outcomes don't escalate that quickly without groundwork. Public explosions that appear spontaneous usually have silent foundations. She also points to language shifts that happened before the fallout, interviews that subtly rephrased alignment, social media captions that sounded neutral but carried distance. None of it obvious, but none of it accidental either. Jaguar claims the energy shifted before the story broke, and energy doesn't shift without cause. She suggests that once private understanding changes, public presentation eventually follows. But when presentation changes before explanation, it signals planning. Planning to control narrative. She doesn't accuse anyone of malice. She accuses them of strategy. Strategy to minimize damage. Strategy to frame perception. Strategy to guide interpretation. According to Jaguar, once strategy enters the room, randomness exits. She says people confuse surprise with spontaneity. Just because the audience was surprised doesn't mean the participants were. She also claims that certain responses were too polished to be reactive, too composed, too aligned with existing branding. Real shock looks messy. This looked managed. She emphasizes that this doesn't mean anyone lied. It means timing was curated. And curated timing changes everything. Because once something is timed, it becomes narrative, not accident. Jaguar says the biggest clue was the speed of stabilization. After the initial noise, things settled quickly. That kind of settling doesn't happen when chaos is genuine. It happens when chaos is anticipated. She asks a simple question. If this was truly random, why did everyone seem ready? Ready statements, ready boundaries, ready silence. Prepared silence is different from stunned silence. According to her, what the audience witnessed wasn't emotional collapse. It was controlled detachment. And controlled detachment doesn't come from shock, it comes from decision. She says this is why she felt compelled to speak. Not because she wanted to inflame anything, but because people were interpreting something structured as something spontaneous. And that misunderstanding matters, because spontaneity implies vulnerability, structure implies power. She claims power was present long before the public noticed anything shifting, and once power is involved, randomness disappears. This wasn't about feelings spiraling, It was about positions solidifying, and once positions solidify privately, the public chapter is just a formality. That's what she says really happened. Not a moment, a process, not a reaction, an execution. And if that's true, then the story people believed was incomplete from the beginning. According to Jaguar Wright, nothing about the fallout began the day it went public. She says the real shift started much earlier, quietly, subtly, almost invisibly, not with an argument, not with a post, not with a headline, with a realization. Jaguar claims there was a moment behind closed doors when alignment changed, not dramatically, but decisively. A conversation where someone recognized that the current dynamic wasn't sustainable. And once that recognition happens, she says, everything that follows becomes strategy. Because once people realize something can't continue the way it has, they don't explode immediately. They reposition. According to Jaguar, the trigger wasn't emotion, it was leverage. She suggests there was a growing awareness of imbalance, not necessarily financial, not necessarily romantic, but structural. Who held influence? Who benefited most? Who could walk away cleaner if things shifted? She says when those calculations enter a conversation, spontaneity leaves. From that point forward, every interaction becomes measured. Jaguar points to subtle behavioral changes that happened weeks before the public caught on. Separate appearances, slightly altered tone in interviews, language that shifted from we to something more individual. None of it dramatic, but consistent. According to her, those patterns weren't mood swings, they were preparation. She claims someone made the internal decision to exit the dynamic, not publicly, not emotionally, but strategically. And once that internal decision is made, the public timeline just needs to catch up. Jaguar says people underestimate how much happens before the moment, before the tweet, before the announcement, before the viral clip. She calls it the cooling phase, where emotions settle and logistics begin. During this phase, she says, messaging is refined, boundaries are clarified, exit routes are discussed. Not in a villainous way, in a practical way. Because once a partnership reaches a breaking point privately, the next question isn't how do we fix this? It's how do we manage this? Jaguar believes that's what happened here. Management overtook emotion. She claims that once management takes control, timing becomes deliberate. Public exposure isn't avoided, it's scheduled. She doesn't mean there was a formal announcement planned from day one. She means the narrative was allowed to surface at a moment that minimized damage and maximized clarity of positioning. That's not chaos. That's containment. According to Jaguar, the real trigger was recognition of shifting power. She suggests one side realized they had more independence than before. More options, more leverage, more room to maneuver. And once independence becomes viable, dependency weakens. That shift changes everything. She says people often think breakups or disputes are triggered by conflict, but sometimes they're triggered by confidence. Confidence to move alone. Confidence to redefine roles. Confidence to stop negotiating. When that confidence appears, alignment fractures quietly. Jaguar emphasizes she's not framing this as betrayal. She's framing it as evolution. But evolution still requires planning. She claims the reason it wasn't random is because no one looked shocked when it happened. Concerned? Maybe, but not surprised. She points to how quickly narratives stabilized afterward. Statements were measured. Boundaries were clear. No uncontrolled spiraling. That suggests rehearsal. Not rehearsal of words. Rehearsal of understanding. Understanding that the shift was inevitable. Jaguar also believes the online explosion was underestimated. She says those involved likely expected reaction, but not amplification. What they didn't anticipate wasn't the fallout. It was the volume. Because once the internet senses structural change, it reacts intensely. Money, power, independence. Those themes trigger projection. Jaguar says that's why this moment felt bigger than it should have. It tapped into something universal. The fear of imbalance, the fear of being blindsided, the fear of being replaced strategically instead of emotionally. She insists the trigger wasn't random conflict. It was clarity. Clarity that something had run its course. And once clarity arrives privately, the public chapter becomes inevitable. That's her core argument. This wasn't a fight that spiraled. It was a conclusion that unfolded. And unfolding takes timing. According to Jaguar Wright, whenever something isn't random, there's a second question that must be asked. Who benefited? Not emotionally, not morally, strategically. She says timing always favors someone, and if the timing was calculated, then someone gained clarity, leverage, or repositioning from how it unfolded. Jaguar makes it clear. She's not accusing anyone of wrongdoing. She's analyzing outcomes, because outcomes tell stories that emotions can't. She explains that when a situation explodes publicly at a specific moment, it rarely interrupts momentum. It often redirects it. She suggests that after the fallout, one side appeared more independent, more autonomous, more in control of their individual narrative. And that matters, because independence is power. According to Jaguar, when a dynamic shifts from shared to separate, the person best prepared for separation tends to stabilize faster. Stabilization is advantage. She says, look at what happened immediately after the dust settled. Were there new appearances, new positioning, new messaging centered around strength and independence? If so, that's not coincidence. That's transition. Jaguar claims the real story isn't about who lost, it's about who pivoted smoothly. Smooth pivots suggest preparation. Preparation suggests foresight, and foresight eliminates randomness. She also suggests that sometimes the gain isn't financial or romantic, it's reputational. If a narrative shifts and one party comes out looking empowered, while the other looks reactive, that shift wasn't neutral. It had direction. Jaguar says audiences often mistake composure for innocence, but composure can also signal readiness. She asks viewers to notice how quickly language changed after the fallout. Words like growth, focus, next chapter, self-alignment. Those phrases don't come from shock. They come from planning. According to Jaguar, whoever was emotionally detached first usually benefits most from public fallout because detachment reduces reaction, and reduced reaction protects image. She says one of the clearest indicators this wasn't random is how contained the aftermath was. No uncontrolled spirals, no chaotic contradictions, no emotional breakdowns, just measured recalibration. Measured recalibration means someone was already standing outside the dynamic before it ended publicly. And the person who steps outside first gains perspective. Perspective equals control. Jaguar also hints that public sympathy often aligns with who appears steady, and steadiness during chaos suggests preparation. She doesn't say this maliciously, she says it analytically. Because in high-visibility spaces, perception is currency. If perception shifts in your favor during fallout, you gained something, even if you lost something privately. She argues that when timing benefits one narrative more than another, timing wasn't accidental. It was convenient, and convenience rarely arrives randomly in public scenarios. Jaguar suggests the biggest gain may not have been external, but internal. Freedom. Freedom from a dynamic that no longer aligned. Freedom from negotiation. Freedom from shared accountability. Sometimes the person who initiates distance does so quietly long before the public sees separation. And when the public moment arrives, they're emotionally 3 steps ahead. That's advantage. She says the audience saw the ending. They didn't see the exit strategy. And every exit strategy serves someone. She emphasizes again, she isn't calling anyone manipulative. She's calling the outcome structured. Structured outcomes create winners in subtle ways, even if both sides experience loss. According to Jaguar, the question isn't who was right, it's who was ready. Because readiness changes everything. The ready party absorbs less shock, speaks less defensively, appears more composed, and composure shapes narrative. She ends this segment with a pointed observation. When something isn't random, someone was prepared, and preparedness is rarely evenly distributed, which means this wasn't just a story of separation, It was a story of positioning, and positioning determines perception long after the noise fades. According to Jaguar Wright, the biggest misunderstanding wasn't about who was right or wrong, it was about what the situation was actually about. She says the internet focused on the surface: emotion, money, pride, ego. But the real shift wasn't emotional, it was structural, and that distinction changes everything. Jaguar argues that people kept debating loyalty and betrayal while completely missing the deeper dynamic, repositioning. She claims this was never just about disagreement. It was about redefining roles. When roles change inside a partnership, whether romantic, professional, or strategic, tension follows. Not because someone failed, but because alignment moved. And when alignment moves quietly, confusion fills the space. She says audiences misread composure as coldness, but composure, in her view, was clarity. Clarity that something had already been decided internally. The public didn't witness a negotiation. They witnessed the aftermath of one. That's the part she believes people missed. She explains that when private negotiations conclude, the emotional intensity has already peaked. By the time it becomes visible, the heavy conversation has already happened. So when people expected dramatic reactions, they saw steadiness instead. And they interpreted that steadiness incorrectly. Jaguar says steadiness doesn't mean indifference. It means resolution happened earlier. She also believes people misunderstood the silence. They assumed silence meant hiding. She says silence meant finality. There's a difference. Hiding implies something unfinished. Finality implies something concluded. She argues that once an internal decision is made, explaining it publicly rarely changes outcomes. So explanation becomes optional. And when explanation becomes optional, audiences feel excluded. That exclusion fueled speculation. Jaguar says the internet doesn't like being left out of conclusions. When the public doesn't receive a full narrative, they construct one. That construction often leans toward drama, because drama is easier to process than quiet structural change. She claims this situation wasn't explosive. It was deliberate. And deliberate shifts rarely look emotional. They look calm. Calm is unsettling when people expect chaos. She also says people misread independence as abandonment. But independence can simply be progression. When someone evolves into a new phase, it doesn't automatically mean someone else was discarded. It means priorities realigned. That realignment might feel personal to observers, but structurally, it can be neutral. Jaguar insists the biggest misconception was assuming someone won. In her view, no one won. Someone repositioned first. That's not victory, that's timing. She says timing often looks like dominance because it creates narrative advantage. But narrative advantage isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's just preparation. She also addresses the idea of betrayal. According to her, betrayal requires deception. She doesn't believe deception was central here. She believes misalignment was. Misalignment is quieter than betrayal, but it's more permanent. When two people move in different directions internally, they can appear aligned publicly for a while, until the strain shows. Jaguar says the public moment wasn't the fracture, it was the reveal of one. And reveals feel dramatic even when the fracture happened long before. She emphasizes this point. You saw the smoke, you didn't see the crack. The crack existed earlier. The smoke was just visibility. She believes people misinterpreted calm exits as cold exits. But calm exits are often compassionate ones. Less spectacle, less accusation, more structure. She says the internet equates intensity with authenticity. But sometimes the most authentic decisions are the quietest. And quiet doesn't trend. So the narrative had to inflate itself to make sense of something that was actually simple. Two positions stopped aligning. One position adjusted faster. That's not scandal, that's evolution. But evolution without explanation feels suspicious. And suspicion filled the gap. Jaguar concludes that what people misunderstood most was thinking this was about conflict. In her perspective, it was about clarity. Clarity doesn't shout. It steps back. And stepping back looks dramatic when everyone expected a fight. According to Jaguar Wright, The reason this situation felt familiar is because it was. Not identical, familiar. She says the public keeps reacting to moments like this as if they're shocking, but structurally, they follow the same blueprint every time. Alignment, pressure, private recalibration, public shift, controlled fallout, silence, repeat. Jaguar believes what happened here wasn't unique. It was patterned. And once you recognize the pattern, randomness disappears. She explains that high-visibility partnerships often begin with emotional synergy and shared ambition. Two energies aligned, moving in the same direction. But over time, growth changes trajectories. One person accelerates. One person stabilizes. One person expands. One person maintains. None of that is wrong. But acceleration and maintenance don't move at the same speed. Jaguar says this is where subtle imbalance begins. Not financial necessarily, not emotional necessarily, but directional. Direction matters. When two people's visions start pointing toward different futures, friction builds quietly. And because the partnership is public, the friction can't surface honestly without risking brand damage. So it gets managed. She argues that the management phase is where most viewers get confused, because management looks calm. It looks supportive. It looks unified. But under management, negotiation is happening. Negotiation of roles. Negotiation of visibility. Negotiation of power. She says by the time the public sees distance, negotiation has already ended. The pattern repeats because public relationships are never just relationships, they're ecosystems, and ecosystems protect stability above all else. Jaguar believes that once a relationship becomes part of an identity, leaving it isn't just emotional, it's strategic. So people don't leave suddenly. They prepare. And preparation always creates the illusion of control when the moment finally arrives. She also says the audience plays a role in this pattern. Audiences expect strength. They expect composure. They expect dignity. So when someone exits calmly, it fits expectation, but it feels suspicious. Why so calm? Why so steady? Because emotional chaos would damage perception, and perception is currency. Jaguar says the cycle repeats because perception is valued more than transparency. Transparency risks vulnerability. Vulnerability risks instability. Instability risks opportunity, so stability wins. Even if it means stories end without full explanation. She argues this is why viewers feel unsettled, not because they were betrayed, but because they sensed something structured without being told it was. She believes what keeps repeating is the silence afterward. Silence becomes the final chapter in every public fracture. And silence, while protective, leaves interpretation open-ended. Interpretation invites projection. Projection invites narrative inflation. And suddenly, a quiet repositioning becomes an explosive drama. Jaguar says this pattern won't stop, because public relationships operate inside incentive systems. Those systems reward timing, reward calm exits, reward minimal scandal, and minimal scandal requires planning. She emphasizes that planning doesn't equal manipulation, it equals awareness. When you know you're operating inside a spotlight, you prepare differently. That's not sinister, it's survival. But survival often looks calculated, and calculated looks intentional. She concludes this part by saying that people should stop asking whether it was random, and start asking why the same cycle keeps appearing across different names, different years, different industries. Because patterns reveal structure, and structure reveals system. And once you understand the system, you stop being shocked. You start recognizing choreography. Not conspiracy. Choreography. Movements aligned, steps rehearsed, exits timed. Not dramatic. Deliberate. She ends with a simple statement. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And choreography, once seen, can't be unseen. According to Jaguar Wright, the real impact of this situation isn't what happened. It's what people learned from watching it happen. She says once you recognize choreography in a public fallout, you stop reacting emotionally, and you start analyzing structurally. And that changes everything. Because when you begin seeing patterns instead of moments, you stop asking, who messed up? And you start asking, how was this positioned? Jaguar argues that understanding the pattern removes the illusion of randomness. And randomness is comforting. Randomness makes things feel human. So patterns make things feel designed. She believes the discomfort people felt wasn't about betrayal or money or ego. It was about realizing how controlled public narratives really are. Control doesn't mean fake, it means managed. And management changes how authenticity feels. She explains that once viewers recognize timing as a tool, silence as a shield, and composure as strategy, they can't go back to naive consumption. They begin watching differently, more carefully, more skeptically, more aware. And that awareness shifts power. Jaguar says public figures operate inside systems that reward smooth transitions. So when a shift happens smoothly, it isn't necessarily cold, it's optimized. Optimized exits protect brands. Optimized statements protect futures. Optimized silence protects stability. But optimization comes at a cost. It costs transparency. She claims the real story here wasn't about drama. It was about how cleanly things transitioned. Too cleanly. And when something feels too clean, people instinctively question it. Not because they want scandal, but because life is rarely that tidy. She argues that what unsettled audiences most was the emotional disconnect, the lack of visible friction, the absence of visible rupture. Because rupture feels real. Clean detachment feels curated. Jaguar believes that once you understand how positioning works, you stop interpreting calm exits as simple maturity. You start asking what groundwork made that calm possible. Preparation, distance, internal resolution long before public visibility. She says this awareness doesn't make you cynical. It makes you literate, narrative literate. You stop reacting to headlines. You start reading between them. She emphasizes that this isn't about distrust, it's about discernment. Discernment allows you to recognize when something unfolds as a process rather than an accident. And once you see process, you stop calling it random. She ends this analysis with a shift in perspective. Instead of asking whether someone planned it, ask, when did the planning begin? Because planning doesn't start at the announcement. It starts at the first internal doubt, the first private conversation, the first moment someone realizes they're moving differently. That's where choreography begins, long before the curtain lifts. Jaguar believes this understanding empowers audiences, because once you stop being shocked by timing, you start expecting structure, and when you expect structure, you become harder to manipulate emotionally. She says that's the real takeaway, not who benefited, not who repositioned first, but how easily narratives guide emotion when structure is invisible. Once structure becomes visible, emotion slows down, reaction becomes analysis, and analysis changes culture. She closes with a final statement. Nothing that big is random. It's rehearsed by reality long before it hits the stage. And with that, the story stops being about individuals. It becomes about awareness, about watching with clearer eyes, about recognizing choreography without assuming conspiracy. Because sometimes the most powerful shift isn't in what happened, it's in how you understand it. And once you understand it differently, you'll never watch public transitions the same way again.